Good morning, and thank you to everyone for being here for this very interesting discussion on migration and the labor market. I'm the Rome correspondent for the Financial Times. I've been here for 3.5 years, and I have to say I've covered both Italy's struggling economy and the kind of difficult faltering economic recovery. Though it has kind of gained traction recently, it still remains one of the Eurozone's great laggards. And I've also covered the migration crisis, heading down to Sicily and some of the southern ports quite often, and really sort of trying to describe both the massive humanitarian operation that has been carried out by, led by the Italian authorities the last few years, but also the kind of noxious, increasingly tense and difficult political debate that surrounds migration here. And I think that this event, this conference, is particularly important just because I think that the relationship between arriving migrants and the integration of arriving migrants into the labor market, and particularly into a struggling labor market, seems to be the key, in a sense, to unlock the sort of political dynamic, or sort of try to, halt the sort of vicious cycle politically that has set in on this issue, and sort of lower the temperature. And that's why this research, I think, is particularly precious and important as we go ahead. As we know, there are concerns in public opinion about wage deflation caused by arriving migrants. There are concerns about jobs being stolen. There are concerns about all sorts of issues that are directly tied to the economic integration of arriving immigrants that have nothing to do, even setting aside some of the sort of more difficult cultural issues. So I think that if one could find a way to kind of square the arrival of immigrants with economic opportunity, I think that could be an extremely precious contribution to the debate. And so with that, I'd like to, I'll leave the floor to the speakers. We have a great panel today, and we'll be introducing them as they take the floor. And then hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. But for now, I'd like to hand things over to Carlo Monticelli, the Vice Governor for Financial Strategy at the Council of Europe Development Bank, and then we will have the presentation of the results of a very interesting study by Zsolt Darvas, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. Thank you.
Buongiorno. Good morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. An opportunity to share with you my thought on the challenge of integration, which is not only economic but a cultural and a political one. And it's a good opportunity also for giving a bit of relevance and profile to the Council of Europe Development Bank, which is less known than I think it should. It is the oldest multilateral development bank after the World Bank, and it was established 60 years ago to finance social investment, and it has continued to do so with not much of a mission creep, focusing on social investment, and hence really with a big involvement on the migration issue. Now. Yeah. The issue has been making the headlines in terms of a crisis. For years now, we are addressing a crisis, and certainly there was an increase in the inflow of refugees that added to the inflow of migrants, and the way the issue has been addressed has been the one of a crisis mode. But the first thing that I think is crucial to appreciate is that the issue of migration is here to stay. So it's not really a crisis. Is an issue that is a difficult one that we as a society are going to be confronted with for quite a long time to go. And why? I mean, there are two fundamental forces that are going to push for a continuation of this flow of migration, that are demographic and economic factors. And these have always been throughout history the basic forces underpinning migration flows. But there are two extra factors that are really increasing the flow. Well, the first one is that the transmission of information, especially images, has been easier as never in the history before. And indeed, this is causing more unhappiness in people who live in lower income countries, because they have a much more intense perception of the difference in the standards of living. Indeed, it might be interesting to quote this fact that when the first survey about happiness was introduced worldwide, there was quite this striking factor that on average people in Nigeria, this was in the mid-80s, and people in Nigeria were as happy as the people in Germany. So this was, making creating a lot of discussions. Money doesn't make you happy. Income is not really a good metric of welfare, and so and so. But then, when it was easier to have an idea of what difference in income meant in standard of living, to have even a pictorial idea of this meant, well, then the average level of happiness came to be actually correlated with GDP. And so the point is that now people in poor countries do see the difference in schools, in food, in everyday conditions. And another factor is that now, fortunately, but the level of socially and ethically acceptable indignities that can be used to stem migration flow has dramatically declined. And I think this is a very important step in terms of civilization of humankind, but in the past we have seen that very drastic measures to stop migrants' flows were taken, and that now, fortunately, would no longer be acceptable. Now, okay, thank you. In my talk, I would want to very rapidly review the factors behind migration, to recall again some factors about migration in Europe, and put forward some ideas about the way forward. This is a bird's eye view talk. I will leave the more detailed aspect to the presentation of the excellent report that has an analysis really underpinning much of the conclusion, the points made here. Now, but before going into the factors of migration, I think it's important to bear in mind the distinction between refugees and migrants. And this is something that clearly in the public debate gets very often confused. But it has to be kept separately because actually the right policy response to these two issues is different. There are certainly similar issues about short-term hospitality, short-term humanitarian crisis, but the big difference is that refugees are escaping a situation, but they would prefer to stay where they are. And hopefully they would want to come back to their homes, to their homeland, as soon the situation makes that possible. And so, in a way, the view of integration, the kind of investment that we have to do, is of a very different nature. Because in a way, if you want to look at the way forward, the rational way is not to give these people tools to integrate in the land where they do not want to go in the first place, but to build up their human capital in a way that it can be brought back when the situation normalizes in their country of origin, and can promote development, hence reducing the difference in income and in the standard of living that are the ultimate engine of migration. Conversely, for migrants, a policy of integration is needed, and also the type of investment, given that these two horizons and two policy objectives are different, are different too. Now, going to the to the factors of underpinning migration. Well, basically there are two: the difference of standards of living and demographic factors. And there is quite important to recall that also from a cultural point of view now, for the way Europe is addressing the issue, is that Europe has long been a continent of emigration and displacement. 50 million Europeans emigrated in the New World, looking for a better life, for a better standard of living, for more opportunities. After the Second World War, 10 million people left Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, to migrate once again, looking for better conditions. So, when there are differences in income, migration, a tendency to migrate is unavoidable. The OECD has put forward some estimates of the elasticity. The truth of the matter is that at the end, migration flows is also a human element dependent on families. You have the existing migration networks that really tend to be one of the key drivers of the localization of the direction of migrants, because people, they tend to go where they know that they will find other nationals who made it in the new country. But the numbers are indeed very, very big. Now, 3% of the population live outside of the home countries. 11% would, if they could. And if we go to Africa, a quarter of the population would like to be elsewhere because they perceive that there is a better opportunity. So, of course, development is the ultimate way to reduce these differences in income. But they are, of course, there to stay, and they are, of course, be the cause of a persistent tendency to migrate. The other factor that makes migration a very big opportunity for Europe is the aging of the population. So it is clear that if you look at this chart, it's just stunning. An aging population has increased hugely the old age dependency ratio. We have moved from the 60s when you had 6 working age persons for each retired person, and now we are going to move to only 2 people for each retired person. So an inflow of human capital that in turn can also help to redress this demographic imbalance is a great opportunity, and certainly a potential win-win situation. Now, if we look at migration in migration in Europe, the first thing to say is that so far there's been a very big element of success already there. That now in the crisis, in the tensions that we will discuss in a while tend to be forgotten. But in the past 10 years, 70% of the increase in Europe's labor force came from migrants who worked, who helped the economy to grow, who gave them an opportunity, the possibility to transfer money to their relatives, very often with in a size that is much more relevant than official development aid. So there has been this success, and indeed there are studies that go more into detail of that. Is that there is also an issue of increase in productivity for the economy as a whole, because basically de facto when they arrive, migrants tend to enter the low skill part of the labor force, just given the opportunity of let's call them natives to move up in the ladder of the workforce with a net increase in productivity. So the point is that both high skill and low skills migrants improve productivity, and of course in the short run they provide a crucial positive contribution to pension systems. And these are facts. These are there. They tend to be forgotten, but they are undeniable facts. And indeed, this should be a success story. But the reality is that integration has been incomplete and wanting, basically because migrants, even second-generation migrants, which is quite amazing, continue to have a worse education, to make worse in school, in the labor market. They have access to low quality and more costly homes. Often they have a worse access to public services. Is a story of then partial integration that transfer through generations, and is also very keen from a cultural point of view, because the cultural integration in Europe, all in all, seems to be less successful than cultural integration in other countries. And indeed, again, it is very difficult to be balanced when recalling these facts, but it is quite staggering that many of the terrorists involved in attacks within Europe were coming from a background of second-generation immigrants, which, with a striking contrast between their cultural extremism and instead a story of good economic integration. At the same time, we have the lack of integration also on the part of people who have a constant tendency to overestimate and grossly overestimate the perception of migrant population. You have all the time talks about a perception of invasion, and it is just not there. Is a poor perception. As equally, you have a perception of the fact that migrants are a cost on public finance, a cost on social services, whereas the truth of the matter is that if one makes an overall assessment on public finance that they are more or less even, they give definitely a net contribution to pension system, and certainly they do not have, on average, a better access to social services. So these data really show that at the end we have an economic success coming together with a poor success in terms of integration, which is really a lack of integration, a cause of suffering on both sides, both for migrants and residents. Now I come to the ideas on the way forward. There is no silver bullet, especially on the most difficult one, on the cultural integration side. But there are good ideas, good reflection that can help us. The first important policy tenet is that to be viable and fruitful and sustainable from a cultural and political point of view, migration flows must be regulated. There is hence a need to have secure borders. And this is something that must be clearly said. Because once again, too often the debate gets confused from a political point of view, and then there are extreme positions say that immigration should totally ban, which is impossible, but equally thinking that we can address successfully the immigration issue without efficient and effective control of borders is just a non-starter. Clearly, with Europe, with the movement of people within Europe, with the Schengen area, there are extra difficulties because, of course, you need a coordinated border policy. Europe has a huge maritime border that has to be patrolled. Now, with the crisis, Europe has moved in the right direction. I won't delve into the details. More has to be done, but it is undeniable that progress are being made and movement in Europe are in the right direction. As usual, one complains that Brussels is slower than it could or it should, but at least I think that there is the reassuring element that of moving in the right direction. The other important aspect is the need for public investment in favor of integration. And this is really as two areas. The first one is of social investment directly focused on making integration and integration in labor market easier. And they are clearly the most urgent and compelling issue is learning skills that are useful to go in the labor market, and starting with the most obvious one, language of the hosting country. And this is something that is really needed. The second issue is one of making social investment, because clearly an increase in population is going to put extra pressure on services like schools, like health services, and if the supply does not meet the added demand, this is inevitably a source of very high tensions. We were discussing before about the fact that migrants have less access to social services than natives, and the perception is exactly the opposite. And this is a scarcity in basic social services that are really the standard, the foundation of a dignified living that are missing. And too often one has to be honest about, too often in many countries not enough social investment has been made, and these are the areas where my bank can provide financing, ideas, assistance, and has a good track record of success. The final aspect is the most difficult one, I believe, because the one where there is more uncertainty. Is the one where we need a perspective to move for a long-term cultural integration that is successful. Now, the truth of the matter is that so far cultural integration has worked on the basis of two opposite extremes. One is the full assimilation. You come to the new country, you learn the language, you pray the same God, you eat the same food, you dress in the same way. Which has the obvious drawbacks and is not viable in the long run, and it has failed. It has not worked. In Europe, certainly. The opposite paradigm was the dream of a fully multicultural society. Anything goes. Every man and woman has the right to do whatever their social custom find acceptable. And this, in turn, has been a myth that has failed because honestly cannot work. There are values, European values, cultural, political, that cannot be sacrificed. And again, I hope that you understand why I, on purpose, want to be brutally shocking. But you know, having the notion that a teenager is infibulated in Europe because it would have been done so when had she been in Africa is simply not acceptable to our values, and I believe rightly so. So these two polar models have shown to fail. A new third way has to be thought about. And this, by the way, is where now the contemporary philosophical debate and cultural debate is really making a reflection. After it had to accept, sadly, the failure of the full multiculturalism. And there are tentative ideas. There is no yet a way, not yet a new paradigm. Is a question of experimentation. Many interesting things have been written, and I like to conclude my talk quoting Ignatieff, a Canadian philosopher and actively involved in policy, who makes the point that really the way forward is to base integration on the ordinary virtues. And by that, he means the basic human values of empathy and compassion that have to be coming from the notion that hospitality is a gift that is a pleasure to give and not only to receive. Really kind of starting from very basic human value to try and deprive the forcing of integration from a high ground moral standing where multiculturalism accepted is a duty and that is imposed, and this does not work, nor at the same time that insisting of rejecting the ordinary virtues in the way they manifest in the hosting country again is not acceptable. So it's a difficult search. But ultimately, I believe that this is the only way to win the ultimate challenge of migration, the challenge of integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now it's on to Zsolt Darvas, and we have some copies of the book up here. So I would say it's going to be a rainy and chilly Saturday, which would give us perfect opportunity to read the study in full.
Thank you very much, Mr. Politi, for introducing this event and introducing me. Also for Mr. Monticelli for giving such an interesting and comprehensive presentation. I have to say our report is very much in agreement with many of your points that you said. But of course, I would also like to thank IAI for cooperating with us in organizing this event, the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, which supported the study, and last but not least, our panelists. We are very pleased to have two top managers from Italian ministries and also two colleagues from the US who just flew through the Atlantic to be here. So indeed, we are very much thankful for all your support. Now, the idea for this report came because indeed what we noticed, and also what Mr. Politi mentioned, that discussions about immigration is often very emotional. So we saw that it would be indeed time and it would to write a very much fact-based research study on various aspects of immigration, and that's what we try to do. So you are all welcome to check our book. It's also available for download. But if you don't have time to read 190 pages, in this presentation I will run through some of the most important topics, and we will make available my presentation slides after the event. So hopefully I can give you some information on what you are planning to do. So if it moves, so let me start with a chart which is to some extent mirroring what Mr. Monticelli have said. This chart shows long-run demographic movements in the current 28 members of the European Union. So it covers all 28 countries in the whole period, including in 1960. And you can see the dramatic fall in the natural change in population, which is due to live births and deaths. Actually, 2015 was the first year when in the EU 28 there was a natural decline. Now, perhaps in Italy, you might not be that surprised that this is happening, because Italy has one of the worst demographic outlook among European Union countries. But these 28 countries also include, for example, the United Kingdom, France, and Poland, where there is still a quite healthy natural growth. So I think it's quite notable that the EU as a whole population is actually started to decline. The other chart, the light blue, could you please go back, shows net immigration, which was quite interestingly close to zero up to the mid-1980s. But since then it started to pick up, and quite obviously it became a much more important source of population increase than natural growth. And then, comes basically that's a policy dilemma, what to do. If you look at Japan, for example, demographic outlook is really adverse in Japan. Their population is projected to decline by 25% in the next 2 or 3 decades, and even projected to decline to 1/2 by the end of this century. So imagine that, population decline of 1/2. Basically, they have to evacuate many cities, scale down major infrastructure, hospitals, schools, trains, and so on and so on. So that's a choice that Japanese had made, because they decided not to allow immigration. Now in Europe, we can say that the choice was to allow immigration. To some extent it was a choice, but also to some extent it was a kind of avoidable, not an avoidable development, because certainly it's much more easier for Japan to protect the Japanese islands, which is quite separated, than in Europe, when we are much closer to many other countries. But whatever were the decision, we indeed see that immigration has become a relatively important source of population increase. And again, let me reflect on Mr. Monticelli's comment, differentiation between refugees and migrants. Even in 2015, which was the peak of the refugee crisis, when 1.2 or 1.3 million new asylum seekers arrived in Europe, even in that year, even more people came from outside the EU. About 1.3 million non-EU citizens entered the EU for non-humanitarian reason. And I think it's frequently forgotten that beyond refugees, we indeed receive many immigrants. Now, having this motivational background, let me show what the studies actually aims to achieve. So we try to, as I said, present a lot of fact-based research on various aspects of immigration. We start with public perception, look at the scale of immigration, look at the economic impact of immigration, we look at integration. These chapters are relatively, in fact, I would say fully facts-based and research-based, but certainly we also have a chapter on policy conclusion, which by definition is a bit more subjective. Now, let's start to show a few charts on public perception. The first chart, I think, is very well known, that immigration, along with fears from terrorism, top the list of concerns of EU citizens. So let me just move to the second one, which presents a global comparison on what are the public perceptions of immigration in different parts of the world. Now, the European Union is in the top. You can see 48% of people saying that they would wish immigration to decrease. If you look at Oceania, Australia, and New Zealand, only 1/4 of the people saying. So clearly, in a global perspective, European citizens are much more adverse to immigration than other parts of the world. But let me just recall a very, very simple and very, very basic observation which was made by one of the speakers at the previous event. He presented this report, Rainer Münz, which is so simple and so basic that I never thought about. But let me just share with you that thought. Also, Mr. Monticelli showed that tens of millions of Europeans left the EU after the Second World War and since then. And when we look at those people, so our nationals who are leaving our country and go to other parts of the world, as fully justified because, you know, they have better opportunities there. So people tend to be very, very supportive of the opportunity that their nationals can leave their country and go to live in another country. But if we look at it from a different perspective, from the other perspective, people are very much adverse of other nationals coming into their home country. So I think there's a major problem indeed with I would say the mindset of people that yes, we can go abroad, that's not a problem, even it is welcome, but foreigners please don't come. So I think that's a kind of contradiction which I think worth highlighting. Now the next chart shows that even though on general Europeans are more adverse to immigration, there's a major difference between immigration from other European Union countries and immigration from third countries. And what this chart shows is that in the European Union as a whole, the share of people who are very positive or fairly positive for immigration from our other EU countries is actually going up. I think this development is not well reflected in policy debates. And now, again, in the EU as a whole, 2/3 of citizens support or have positive views about immigration from other EU countries. I have to say that Italy is at the lower scale. So in Italy, it's only 1/2 of citizens are supportive of immigration from other EU countries. So as I said, Italy is in general, Europe is in general anti-immigration, and Italy is even more than the average Europeans. But still, I think 1/2 is a significant number, and it has been increasing. The next chart compares the support for intra-EU and extra-EU immigration. So in the horizontal, you can see in each country support for intra-EU immigration. I also highlighted Italy. It's a little bit above 1/2. While on the vertical, you can see the support for immigration from outside EU. And it also shows a 45-degree line, which would indicate equal support for both types. And clearly, it's very clear that indeed Europeans tend to favor much more immigration from other EU countries. But also there are a couple of countries, like even in the UK, and where immigration was a big debate, there's quite a strong support both for intra-EU and also extra-EU immigration. Now, next question is whether this support is related to the actual presence of immigrants. Now, this may be a bit complicated chart, but let me just say what the big message is that we cannot find support that in countries when there are more immigrants, there are more negative views. So this cannot be supported. If anything, I mean, if you exclude outliers, for example, Estonia and Latvia have a very large share of Russian minorities, and they have a very low view of support for immigration from outside of the EU, probably for security reasons. For example, if you exclude Estonia and Latvia, you can even see a positive relationship on the right panel, showing that in countries when there are more immigrants, there are more positive views toward immigration. And I think this is a very interesting finding, and indeed shows that perhaps countries maybe that have more immigrants, they have better policies to integrate them, they have more interactions with them, and they learn that those people can integrate well into the society. Now, another problem is the perception of people about simple facts of immigration can be very incorrect. Here, it's a survey by Ipsos, and people were asked, what's their opinion? What is the share of immigration in their country? And I highlighted Italy. You can see the red line. It's 30%. So people in Italy believe that 30%, almost 1/3 of population, are composed of immigrants. Now, it's very difficult to define who is an immigrant. So, so in this chart, we indicate two indicators. One is the share of foreign citizens. This is this light blue, which in Italy is about 8%. And the other one is the share of people who were born abroad. In Italy, it's a little bit below 10%. But whatever indicator you see a huge gap that indeed people's perception is sometimes very, very far from reality. And this is not just related to the numbers, and not just related to Italy, by the way. I mean, you can say the same is in Japan, even in the US and Canada. So people tend to overestimate the actual presence of immigration. The clear implication of this simple finding is that certainly what is really crucial is that debate about immigration should not be emotional, but as fact-based as possible. And the last slide on perception just summarizes that there's also a little bit of contradiction, that even though people sometimes are very much have adverse views about immigrants, and they also disapprove the way the refugee crisis was managed in EU, still most Europeans, including Italians, wish to see much more European involvement in immigration policies, for example, for a European asylum policy, a common policy, and they also wish to see increased fights for illegal immigration, including the involvement of the European Union. Now, the time is running, so I'm afraid I will have to skip some of the slides, but in my remaining time, I would like to highlight some of the key ones of them. So first is, what is the scale of immigration? And you know, it's a little bit difficult to say whether it's, you know, large or small or whatever. So basically, I just decided to present some numbers. Since we are in Italy, I use here the numbers from Italy. So you can see that in Italy, again, according to citizenship, there are about, let's say, about 3% of Italian residents are citizens of other European Union countries. A bit less than 6% are citizens of non-EU countries, and the home country citizens account for 91.5%. As I said, you know, there's a citizenship maybe not the best indicator. If you look at foreign-born, then their share would be a little bit higher. But overall, I wouldn't say that immigration reached such a high level. The next table shows the same data for the aggregate of 11 so-called Northern and Western European countries, which are the first 15 EU member countries, excluding Italy, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. So the largest destination countries like United Kingdom, Germany, and France, and so on. And again, you see a quite similar picture. Home country citizens account for almost 91%, while roughly 4% are from other EU countries and another 5% from non-EU countries. And whether this is high or low, it can be subject to debate. In my view, it's not that high. And certainly if you look at the flows, because this shows the stock of population, but if you look at annual flows, they are very well below values observed in the United States or Canada. So even though mobility has increased somewhat, they are still not that large in our view. But certainly mobility has some important implications, and the next chart shows a very important one, which is labor shortages and the possibility of brain drain. So this chart shows for, again, for the aggregate of Central European countries, Northwest countries, and Southern European countries, the share of companies in the industry and services sectors which report labor shortages as a problem. And before the crisis, you could see labor shortages were increasing, especially in Central Europe and in Northwest Europe. With the crisis, certainly this problem disappeared with increase in unemployment. But more recently, labor shortages increased to very, very high levels. Not in Southern Europe, because unfortunately, for example, Italian economy is recovering, which is a very good news, but still not yet recovered. But in Germany, UK, and other major countries, also major labor shortages are building up, not to mention Central European countries, which really face major dramatic labor shortages. And you know, if there are labor shortages, you know what you can do? Basically, you can do three things. One is to employ robots, so improve technological developments and robotize whatever you can, but it's certainly easy to say, more difficult to do. Another one is to allow immigration. As I said, there are some resistance to immigration, so many people would not be happy to that. Or the third one is to somehow try to boost, the local labor force by increased labor force participation and increased fertility rates, which again are not easy jobs. So I think the choices are very, very limited. Certainly a number of possible policy measures which could be adopted. But I'm afraid that without immigration, these labor shortages problems will become even more severe. Now, let me skip the next slide and just show the next one, which shows just the number of first-time asylum seekers who entered the EU. We all know there was a huge spike. Recently, it's coming down. But the next one, which shows, which also have some policy implications. I don't know if I should continue, or can you hear me? No? Okay, thank you very much. So, what Okay, so let's try. So this chart shows the share of positive first instance asylum decisions made in different European Union countries. And you can see that some countries like Italy, for example, is relatively consistent at about 40% or one half. But there are major differences across countries. For example, if you look at Poland or Hungary, they approve only about 15% of asylum applications, a very, very low share. If you look at other countries like, initially Belgium, Malta, and so on, some of the other countries approve 80% of asylum applications. So what this chart shows that the very, very different rates of acceptance of asylum applications in different European Union countries. Now, one explanation for that could be the different composition of asylum seekers. For example, it could be that for Malta, only indeed people coming from Syria fleeing the war arrived, while for Poland or Hungary, maybe people who just economic migrants and wanted to use the inflow of refugees to get an easy entry into the EU. But there are also some research which looked at the composition of asylum seekers and concluded that it doesn't explain these huge differences. So what this chart shows, in my view, is that European asylum rules are actually implemented very differently across European Union countries. And I think this is a major problem for many, many reasons. For example, it might lead to diversion. So if migrants or refugees believe that they have a much lower chance in obtaining granted asylum position in one country than in another, then certainly they will go to the country where they have a higher chance, and certainly this will lead to a very disproportionate burden. This is shown by the next chart, which shows what was the share of the EU countries in three indicators: the first-time asylum applications, the positive decisions, and also in GDP. Again, I highlighted Italy and 2017, and you can see that Italy had indeed a very, very high share of first-time applications. it is a much lower share in actually approved applications, partly because of the very long time that it takes to approve refugees. But if you look at Germany, certainly Germany has more than 60% of positive decisions. So clearly there's a very unequal burden, and better burden sharing would be needed. I think this is one of the topics which is heavily discussed in your country. Now coming to the next chapter, the economic impact of immigration, maybe I just run through it very, very quickly and basically say that again, in line what Vice Governor Monticelli has said, that we surveyed hundreds of articles, looking at academic articles, assessing the impact of immigration on labor markets, on public finances, and on output. And basically, a very, very key conclusion is that there is no conclusive evidence that migrants take away the jobs of natives and reduce their wages. Certainly, it very much also depends on the composition of migrants. Certainly, if someone comes from, with a work reason, or an entrepreneur enters into the European Union, then these migrants certainly tend to contribute much more to the economy. While if they will bring their families later, the children will go to school, they might use the healthcare service more often. So there's a lot of dynamic interactions. But overall, I think the literature very much concludes that the public perception, which is very widespread in many countries, that migrants just take jobs away from natives and they take out fiscal resources instead of contributing, is not well supported in the academic literature, and it's very frequently found the opposite. Now let me skip a couple of charts and come to the integration part, one more, so integration of migrants. And here, again, what we found is very much in line with what Mr. Monticelli reported, is that the integration report is not a success for a number of countries. I have to say in most countries. Here I have two countries which are successful, Sweden and the United Kingdom, and I use two other countries which are less successful, Italy and Belgium. Just let me explain what you can see here. So here you can see the labor force participation of people with different backgrounds, the native born, the first generation migrants who arrived from abroad, and the second generation migrants who were born in their host country from immigrant parents. Now, a successful integration effort or result would lead to the finding that second generation migrants, so those people who were actually born in their host country, do as well as natives. But you can see here that in Sweden and the UK, the gap is not large. So there's some gap. Second generation labor force participation is somewhat lower, but not dramatic. But if you look at Belgium, the native born participate 68%, the second generation only 59%. And if you look at Italy, native born labor force participation 63%, and the second generation migrants only 48%. So clearly, second generation migrants in many, many countries are not well integrated. Now, this is for total population. The next table shows for tertiary educated people and shows much better results, including for Belgium and Italy, clearly highlighting that education has a very, very important role in integration policies. Now let me skip the next slide and the next one too, and come here. Another aspect is possible overqualification. So how people feel whether the work they are doing is basically in line with their qualifications and experience, or they are overqualified. And again, I highlighted Italy. You can see in Italy, almost 1/2 of people with an immigration background believe that they are overqualified for the jobs. Now, again, this has very, very major policy implications. It relates to a much better and faster ways for recognizing qualifications obtained elsewhere. Again, sometimes some countries are doing better. Belgium, in this regard, is not that bad. Also Germany, but in a number of countries, including Italy, the results are very, very weak. The next one is again, what is a very, very sad picture, is the share of early school leavers. Now, we do not have a distinction between first and second generations, but we have distinction between the immigrants come from other EU country or from non-EU country. And again, I highlighted Italy. You can see that the share of early school leavers is much, much higher for people with an immigrant background than a native country. I have to say that only in the United Kingdom, the share is either the same for other EU countries or even lower for non-EU countries. But in all other EU countries, unfortunately, the school dropout rates are much higher for immigrant children. Again, this also relates to some of the issues that Mr. Monticelli mentioned, that some of these immigrants live in very segregated areas. The quality of the schools are not that good in those areas, and need call for much better desegregation measures. The next one shows PISA test, reading literacy. Again, it's very well documented in the literature that possessing the language of your host country is absolutely crucial for success in education and also in work. Now, what you can see here, again, what are the PISA scores for reading for native children or students, second generation and first generations. And again, even for Italy, you can also see here that even second generation migrants outperform relative to natives. Natives also don't do as well as, let's say, in Finland, Canada, or Germany, but second generation migrants even outperform more, which again suggests that there should be major improvements in education systems and better schooling are needed for immigrant children. Now, the next chapter of the report discusses financial inclusion of refugees. Beyond surveying the literature, we conducted our own survey of financial institutions, which lead to some very interesting results. But due to the sake of time, let me not go through the slides, but just let me tell you the key conclusions. I believe in the discussion, Mr. Cicciani will talk a lot about financial inclusion. So what we found is that there is a kind of opposing forces between tightened financial regulation to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing on the one hand, and the need for financial inclusion of refugees. And certainly this makes the job of financial institutions to offer financial inclusion much more difficult. Now, what we found in our survey is that many banks assess that regulation doesn't strike a right balance between, let's say, anti-money laundering laws and the need for offering financial services to refugees, but in fact they are tilted to be much more restrictive and making that difficult. We also found, a little bit not surprisingly, that banks are also not very much interested in offering financial services to refugees. They don't regard them as a very interesting business prospect, unfortunately. But they also have a number of good suggestions on what to improve and how to improve. And certainly, one very important suggestion is to, let me go a bit more. More. One more. Yeah. So I think a very useful suggestion would be to create a pan-European system of registry of refugees with a European ID to each asylum seeker and refugees. I think that would, first of all, help a lot in identification. So it would help not just financial inclusion, but in general identification in many other aspects of life. It would also help a lot to track how these people are actually going, because also what happened in the past is that many times people who arrived in Europe, they filed asylum applications in different countries, and basically they went there where they received a positive decision. Again, I think this is not good. So I think one very important suggestion is the creation of this pan-European system and a related ID. Now, my time is over, so I don't really have much time to list our policy recommendations, but let me try to just say a few of them. So again, I would like to start with the issue of addressing anti-immigration attitudes. Again, what I see in many countries is that public debates on immigration are really emotional. Now, people have emotions, so certainly, I mean, we have to accept that people have views if they see, you know, someone who is dressed differently and behaves differently, then that certainly evokes emotions. But what would be very important is to try to base public debates on facts as much as possible. Now, I know it's difficult and easier said than done, but also in some countries, and let me now use my own country, Hungary, where I think the information which is provided by the government about immigration many times are simply not correct, and in fact fuels an anti-immigration sentiment. I think it would be much more better to have a more balanced view and provide accurate information on facts and research findings. Now, protecting EU borders, again agreeing with Mr. Monticelli, is certainly very important. I think Europe should help those who are indeed genuine asylum seekers and refugees. I think humanitarian help is indeed a core value of the European Union. But again, we should be, I think, be able to somehow separate those people who are indeed actual asylum seekers from those who are not. As Mr. Monticelli said, 25% of African population would be happy to come here. It's so unfortunate that we cannot host all of them, but indeed we cannot host. I mean, we cannot host 25% of African population. So certainly, what the EU should do much more. In fact, the EU is the biggest provider of foreign aid. Maybe Marcel Escobari will also speak a little bit about foreign aid issues. But certainly, one aspect is trying to help those countries to improve peace, address climate change, improve prosperity, alleviate poverty, provide good learning and studying opportunities there. So I think that would be a very important, and building this partnership would be really crucial. Now, one other more concrete is certainly in the European Union budget, a very large share. If we add everything which is even indirectly related to immigration, then only about 2% of the EU budget is spent on immigration-related issues. Now, given that this is the largest, the most important concern of citizens, I think the European Union budget should also reflect this importance, and at least in the next multi-annual framework, much higher European resources should be devoted to this issue. I already spoke about the uneven implementation of EU asylum rules and the need for more harmonization, the uneven distribution which should be addressed. In the point 7, also the European ID and the system would be very important. Coming back to integration, as I said, for example, the experiences of Sweden and the United Kingdom are much better than, let's say, the experiences of Belgium or Italy. So I think there's a lot to learn from each other. Yeah, given that time is running, maybe just to the last slide. Let me also mention that the EU itself has, I think, a very useful strategy for immigrant immigration, which I think is not well articulated in many countries. On financial regulation, I already spoke about, and on labor shortages, there are also a couple of measures which could be done. One important measure is related to the tax benefit system. We see in many countries where, for example, there are major labor shortages in industry and construction, which are typically low-paid employees work there. We see that the total tax and social security burden is very high on the lowest earning segments of the society. So basically making income taxes and social security contributions more progressive, and certainly also moving away taxation from labor toward ideally wealth or inheritance. I think that would not just help to increase labor force participation and help to alleviate labor shortages of low-paid jobs, but also help to improve fairness in the society. So with this final note, let me stop here. Thank you for listening to me, and again, let me thank our panelists for agreeing to come to contribute to this debate, and I very much look forward to listening to your contributions.
Thank you very much, Jolt. That was really, really fascinating. And now we'll move on to the panel. I would ask, we'll go in order, the order of the program, and I would ask our panelists to limit their presentations to 10 or 15 minutes at the most, because we do want to have a little bit of time for questions, and we need to wrap up at 1:30. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Roberto Cicciani, the Director General for the Prevention of Use of Financial System for Illegal Purposes at the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to the Bruegel and the Istituto for Affari Internazionali for this kind of invitation to the Ministry of Economy and Finance. I will take this opportunity to discuss with other colleagues and with Carlo Monticelli and Zalt Dvars. I hope the pronunciation is fine. The contents of Chapter 6 of this report that is particularly interesting and comprehensive on all the immigration aspects. As you know, or as you will know after reading the report tomorrow morning, as Mr. Politi suggested, in a probably rainy day tomorrow. Chapter 6 deals with financial inclusion, and in particularly address the link, the relationship between two goals. One is integrating, also from a financial perspective, migrants, and the other one is ensuring the legality of the financial transactions and the implementation and application of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing provisions. Chapter 6 highlights different perceptions, barriers, and initiatives to improve integration, in particular financial integration. And as was highlighted in previous intervention, the report includes very interesting policy recommendations, in particular recommendation number 7, dealing with the identification of refugees, that, as you know, is the first step in the customer due diligence procedure for any client, including native people, of course, not only foreigners. And recommendation 11, dealing with guidelines, specific guidelines from public authorities for financial inclusion by banks and other financial intermediaries. The main question for us is to examine whether these two goals, financial inclusion and, I would say, full legality, full application of anti-money laundering requirements, if these two goals are in conflict, or if these two goals are indeed coordinated goals. Different views are described in Chapter 6 of the report, and I would like to give you my views in in this short presentation. The first step is to look at the anti-money laundering new challenges, and I would just recall that all the anti-money laundering system, which includes preventive and law enforcement measures, of course, is a keystone for legality as an ethical and economical value. And this is, I would say, the first step for any economic development and financial inclusion program. An effective anti-money laundering framework, as you know, changes back to back with the new challenges posed by the evolution of financial sector, in particular new technologies, the fintech issue that you know. Of course, different goals, different priorities may originate trade-offs and possible conflicts amongst them. The issue for us today is to look if there is really a conflict between anti-money laundering and financial. The challenges we know from the debate in the international community that the main challenges are the predicate crimes for money laundering, so where the illegal money comes from. So the main crimes relevant for money laundering are corruption, tax avoidance, and human trafficking, in addition to drug trafficking. The threats: money laundering, terrorism, and the financing of terrorism. The emerging threats deal with the new technologies and the flows of illicit money through any unofficial, unregulated channel, which hamper the possibility to trace and detect possible illegal, suspicious activities for money laundering, both at national and international level. Immigration, in this context, poses a number of additional risks, because we are dealing with people moving from one country to another and using the financial or the remittance systems to move funds back to their countries, to their families, and this is a channel that can be misused also for terrorist activities or for money laundering activities. But of course, the large majority of migrants are conducting legal activities. The preventive measures in the anti-money laundering field. All the preventive measures are based on the so-called risk-based approach, so flexible implementation of the measures and their application by obliged entities in relation to the risk linked to that specific client, to that specific financial transactions. So all the new strategies and policies at international level by the international community, including all the European Union legislation on this matter, are based on the risk-based, and the pillars of the anti-money laundering system are the customer due diligence, the so-called know your customer approach, record keeping to ensure traceability and detection of activities also if they occurred in the past, and the suspicious transactions reporting system, where the obliged entities have to report any suspicious case to the competent authorities for further financial analysis and investigation actions where relevant. Of course, all these measures and the impact of these measures pose problems because they may interfere with other priorities, for example, financial inclusion, because of course all the implementation, the compliance costs for the implementation may make the costs of the services or the financial services in a certain way higher. So let's look at the trade-off and look at the financial inclusion as a tool for the integration of migrants. Of course, providing access to an adequate range of safe, convenient, affordable financial services and products to disadvantaged and vulnerable persons is a keystone in financial integration and integration more broadly. Financial inclusion entails reduction of poverty and favors financial and monetary stability, and is about providing an opportunity for the unbanked and financially underserved people to participate in the formal financial system, thereby helping them to lift out of poverty and enter the economic mainstream. Entering the economic mainstream is not only in the interest of migrants, but it basically is in the interest of our countries, of our society, for a number of reasons, including avoiding any form of tax evasion. An important role is played by the money remittance operators, of course. They are not part of the traditional banking system, but they are regulated and they apply all the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing measures. What is interesting to highlight is that the activity of the money remitters deals only with moving funds abroad, so funds coming back to their countries, to their families in the countries of origin, but it doesn't ensure any traceability or on the origin of the funds and on the income of funds from migrants. That is ensured only if the salaries to immigrants, for example, are paid through the financial system on banking accounts. So it's important that we took these in consideration. Of course, restrictions on and the implementation of the anti-money laundering measures may make the costs higher and may move immigrants in the unregulated and illegal system, hampering financial inclusion. The terrorist threat, of course, is one of the main concerns of the authorities. But what is really risky for financial inclusion is the so-called de-risking approach by banks and financial intermediaries, that they do not want to run the risk of having as customers immigrants, because in most cases they come from countries that have deficiency in the anti-money laundering system and are considered high risky, which implies for the banks to apply enhanced due diligence. How to deal with this trade-off? First, as the two recommendations in the report say, we should highlight that for immigrants the main problem is the identification, because sometimes they have no documents. So it's very important that the policy recommendation is taken into consideration, follow also at the European level for an identity document recognized at least within the whole the European Union. And the second recommendation, of course, that was in part already taken on board by the European Banking Association Authority, at European level, with guidelines on asylum seekers to be recognized and identified by banks. exactly. It was in April 2016. The European Banking Authority opinion on this matter. In conclusion, I would say that from our perspective, the two goals we mentioned at the beginning are coordinated. They are not in conflict. And the cooperative approach is the right way forward. Cooperation at three different levels. At the international level amongst countries and in the international fora to strengthen the level of compliance with the standards by all the countries from which immigrants come, so that we have no high-risk countries and enhanced due diligence on such jurisdictions by our banks. The second level of cooperation is in the European Union, taking on board the recommendation on the single document recognized for the identification of refugees, and at national level, of course. Third, and very important cooperation is on between, I would say, cultural integration and financial inclusion, taking on board the fact that in the labor market, and this is particularly a problem in Italy, we face problem with illegal, undeclared workers in order to avoid to pay taxes. So there are a number of factors that play against the financial inclusions. Not only the fact that it's difficult for the banks to identify the immigrants, but also the fact that in some cases they are employed in not regular, not declared jobs, where the salaries are paid in black. So we think that a cooperative approach on all these different aspects is necessary, and it would help to fight against money laundering, but also to enhance the level and the economy of our labor market. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Roberto, for your presentation. Now on to Manuela Scobari, who will provide us sort of a private sector perspective on this, since she is at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Thank you.
It's Marcella, but it's close enough.
Oh, Marcella. Oh, sorry.
No, thank you, James, and congratulations to Bruegel for a very, I think, timely report in a topic that, as you said, tends to flare so much passion and is increasingly polarizing. I think you've brought a great set of influential experts and a very data-rich discussion. So my experience with immigration comes from spending almost a decade helping run a research center at Harvard focused on international development. And there, immigration was always at a core topic. And our research results were very much consistent to Mr. Monticelli's and the Bruegel report, which is that immigration brought growth and dynamism to countries. And we actually looked at its role in the transfer of know-how between countries, which, if we could say there's any secret sauce to development, it was that. And then I also spent, before joining the center, time with the Obama administration running USAID for Latin America. And this was at the time where the organization was front and center in responding to the crisis also, as they termed it, of unaccompanied children crossing the border from Central America, fleeing violence and warlike situation in the Northern Triangle. And this, of course, as the inflow was overwhelming the detention centers in the Mexican border, in the backdrop of this, we had a very divisive presidential campaign going on where migration, immigration, and nationalistic politics was taking, center stage. So nothing that you could relate to in Italy. But you know, in this topic, I think in all the my experience with immigration, I don't think I have seen in topics that affect countries a topic where data and politics are furthest apart, which is why I appreciated the focus of this report, which was less on whether immigration is good or bad, and more on how can we integrate better and faster. And I think that the lessons that Europe takes in integrating this new inflow of migrants and refugees is going to be relevant way past your borders. So the 2 points that I wanted to make are one on the role of the private sector and the role of aid and research in finding long-term solutions. So in terms of the role of private sector, let me give you the example of MasterCard. I see there's 3 roles. One is an obvious one, which is philanthropy, right? And MasterCard actually did a remarkable thing when it IPO'd. It set aside 10% of its stock and put it in a foundation, which now has grown 20-fold, and I think it's one of the largest private foundations in the US, and has a Chinese wall with the company, and it focuses on youth employment in Africa. Then there's a center, which is where I sit, which is a very unusual way of doing philanthropy that I'm excited about, because it uses it sits inside of a company, and it uses the assets of the company, the data, the products and services, the expertise, the technology, and applies it to social goods. And in particular for the center, we focus on driving and understanding inclusive growth. And if we are trying to think of a population, I mean, immigrants and refugees are probably some of the most excluded populations, which is the reason why we wanted to understand what could drive inclusion in those populations. But I think the part that holds most promise is actually the company, or any company, creating products and services that can accelerate this inclusion. And I actually was demoing some of these products that MasterCard has created for some of these issues. Because if we can really use the capabilities of private companies to solve social goods, this is much more powerful than even the money that they can provide. And one of these examples is in the humanitarian space where I worked, where MasterCard has devised a product called MC Aid, which is trying to solve for a long-term problem in disaster relief, which is a delicate trade-off between providing immediate assistance when you need it, and not inundating a market with free goods that tend to distort the local market. So this product, what it does is it's an off-grid payment system. So it gives recipients of aid a card with points, and it gives merchants a tablet with batteries where it can translate those points into goods that they hold. And you know, a week later, when they go to the nearby village that has connectivity, it can turn these points to cash. And you know, coming from having had to respond to the hurricane in Haiti in 2017, where we were sending, as the U.S. government, military helicopters, where we spent millions of dollars just in that first week in transporting goods and services, you want to, as fast as possible, to translate that to cash that could turn into goods into the local economy and try to minimize it. The second example I wanted to share, and this product is already being used, I think, in Yemen, where the financial sector said either won't go in or can't exist. But it's also being used, I think, in Nigeria, Kenya, and in Greece. The other one is one that's about to be piloted that I was very excited about because it deals with one of the issues that you discussed, which is a digital tokenized ID, where that they're hoping to test with the Red Cross, used by NGOs that can serve as a temporary or an ID for refugees, so that the NGOs can identify the recipients. You can understand their trajectory as they move and coordinate aid among NGOs. But this identification, though, is owned by the refugee. And of course, these are all, you know, products in lieu and in need of, that could become much bigger and useful with regulation that is precise on these issues, right? Because, I mean, basic identity and financial access can make a huge difference, as you mentioned, in speeding up the integration of migrants and refugees to access markets, to access services, and to have a track record inside of a country. And these are things that we all take for granted. But this basic identity and financial access, without it, we enter into a cycle of dependency and hopelessness. So for these products to work, and much more sophisticated products, as you were mentioning, the private sector just needs clear rules of engagement. You need regulation for markets to work. And when we're talking about these populations, I think you need specific regulation to be able to attract more private sector solutions in a sector that is already complex and pretty risky. So my last point is one that seems pie in the sky, and it's usually a convenient way to end presentations, where you could say that you can only deal with this issue if you focus on the root causes of migration, and we improve the conditions in poor countries. But I actually think that this is doable, and it is the only way to deal in the long term with illegal immigration and the human suffering that it creates. And to give you one example on this is, so the US, and this was a difficult push, ended up doubling its aid to Central America to 750 million as a response to this crisis. And it was actually the Vice President Biden at the time that convinced Congress, and it was one of the rare times that Congress decided to do aid to deal with an immigration problem and not to invest directly in the border, which would have been a lot more expensive. And there was a lot of pressure to try to show that this was having results. But as you know, and anybody who's been working in aid, this takes generations, right? It's only now that we are seeing the changes in migration patterns in the US with Mexico, where for the first time we have, there are more Mexicans leaving the US than coming into US. And that's a function of the development of Mexico, of the crisis in the US, et cetera. So being able to prove that there is this correlation is very important for aid effectiveness and for a different perspective on dealing with immigration. So one of the things that we did when I was at USAID is we actually gave our data from Health and Human Services to a center, the Center for Global Development, a think tank, to analyze immigrants who were leaving neighborhoods in Central America where the murder rate had gotten incredible. It was 20 times larger than the US. To analyze the impact of our programs that had been going only for 6 to 10 years on reducing that murder rate on departures and immigration. And we were able to prove that a reduction or an increase in a murder per year in these communities led to 3.7 unaccompanied children apprehended in the border. So I think this is the kind of research that was very important as evidence for a root causes approach and a much more sustainable approach to immigration, which is why I hope that Bruegel continues to bring data to this conversation, and that we find solutions that are not only economically viable and make economic sense for migrants and its host countries, but are consistent with our values of helping everyone achieve a better life. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I definitely have some follow-up questions for both of you, but let's go ahead to Tatiana Esposito, Director General for Immigration and Integration Policies at the Italian Ministry of Labor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much to the organizers, to Bruegel and YAI for inviting me today. And if the organizers and James don't mind, I will not make use of my PowerPoint presentation. It will stay there, available for you, because I feel it's maybe more interesting for me to react and add and comment on some of the issues that have been highlighted before and some of the evidence and recommendations from the report. And first of all, let me do a very small introduction about what are we talking about, because we have to be very careful when we talk about migration. There is sometimes the risk to confuse different aspects. We have 5 million migrants legally residing in our countries, and we have an important influx of migrants from the central Mediterranean route in the last years. These are two very different phenomena and need to be addressed with different instruments. And I think before me, Carlo Monticelli stressed this important difference, which implies an effort to identify different investment priorities and different policy measures to address the different challenges. Having said that, I will concentrate my comments on a few recommendations emerging from the report. I was supposed to talk about mainly labor market integration, and I will do it. But before, I cannot abstain to say something on the perceptions concerning the migration issue. It's not a secret. I mean, it has been said, it's a very emotional theme. We have emotions, we have fears. But what's the role of a public administration, of an institution? It's to be transparent, to collect, analyze regularly data and information, and to make them available for everyone. This is why we have invested and are still investing a lot on this kind of work, producing several sets of reports on different aspects of the migration issue regularly. You will find them, all of them, in our web portal dedicated to the integration of migrants. One of these reports addresses specifically the issue of the integration of migrants into the labor market and their performance in our labor market. And many of the information you can find there are very much consistent with what emerges from your study. I will say a few words on 2 or 3 aspects, just to build on what you presented before. The aspect of skills, the aspect of how people access to the labor market in our country, and the issue which was mentioned before by Roberto of undeclared work. Take them as a few examples. Skills, it's true, there is an issue of overqualification of migrants into a labor market, and this has a consequence also in terms of remuneration gap, which is quite important. This is true. This is true also to a less extent, but it's still important for natives, especially young natives. If we have a look to how people access to the labor market in our country, we still have a problem in terms of weakness of our employment services. And this is true for migrants, this is true for natives, more or less to the same extent. So the way people find jobs in Italy is through informal channels, which in the case of migrants are often ethnic channels. And this has a consequence in terms of professional segregation in certain sectors, for example, in case of migrants. But this is true also for us. And finally, undeclared work. On this issue, I think we have to be very careful, because otherwise we run the risk to combine migration with undeclared work. And it's more or less the same risk of combining migration with terrorism. Undeclared work is an issue for us too. These three examples to say that if we have a look to our systems, how our system work, with the eye of a migrant or of a vulnerable people, this is a very important opportunity to highlight what doesn't work in our systems for us too. So it's very important to have a look to these weaknesses, having this in mind, intervening to fix what doesn't work is useful for everyone, not only for migrants participating in our labor market. I add to this that into the migration universe, there are several communities. And it's important to have a look into the communities also to design targeted policies. And one of the other products we make available regularly every year for everyone are our community reports on the 15 most important, in terms of numbers, communities in our country. Because if you have a look into the Chinese community or into the Egyptian community or into the Philippines community, you will find that there are very different labor market performances. And you understand that maybe for sure, in some cases there is a huge gender issue. And this gender issue needs to be addressed with targeted measures. In the community reports, I will not add more on this. You will find also a box dedicated to the financial inclusion of migrants. In the last 2 years, we decided to devote some attention also to this aspect, which is very important in terms of integration of migrants. Then I go to recommendations 8 to 10, I will say, altogether. So I try to stay brief. And also in this case, I need to stress that three things. First of all, that when we talk about integration policies, we do not have to make the mistake to think that integration measures are measures addressed to migrants. Because integration is always a bidirectional issue. So investments and actions need to be addressed to our community as a whole. The second thing I want to stress is that we need to take into account when assessing integration policies in our country the constitutional organization of competencies. When we talk about integration, we refer to a quite wide set of policies. For example, vocational training, earth, housing. All these policies are in the hands of regions in Italy. This is our constitution. So we have to go and have a look to the regional level to assess what's going on the ground. On the other side, we have the EU level, the EU action plan and the integration of third country nationals has been mentioned before. It's true, there is a lot to get inspiration from into the action plan. This is what we try to do. In between, in this case, there is the ministry. How the ministry can play its role, taking into account this set of competencies, how we are trying to interpret our role in between these two levels. And here I want to very briefly say that we are, on the one hand, helping the regions do their job. I make it very easy to understand. Financially, forcing them to elaborate and implement regional plans on integration, different the one from the other because there are different situations on the ground, but all of them focusing on what we thought were the main pillars to be addressed into a regional action plan. And I will just mention the 4 pillars. Education skills, school segregation, dropout, all the things that have been mentioned before. Access to services for the integration, all kinds of services. Employment services, housing services, health services, whatever. 3rd pillar, communication. Qualified communication, 2 words. Yeah, I will stay in the 5 minutes. Don't worry. Qualified communication for migrants. And finally, active participation to society and empowerment of migrants associations. And there are 20 regional plans going on till the end of this year, but we are already planning. A couple of days before, I was sitting in a room like this with all the regions to plan the 2nd phase of this regional action plan till 2020. What we do directly, and we are legitimated in a way to intervene directly because of the particular vulnerability of the target, is to offer personalized path for integration into the labor market to vulnerable migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, unaccompanied minors in proximity of adulthood. And we are running these programs, and they have been both identified as best practices for the integration of third country nationals by the European Commission, and for this reason we are planning the scale-up of both projects to be continued in the future. I will jump some other things because I want to close this intervention sharing with you some information about an initiative that I think, at least to my knowledge, doesn't exist in other EU countries and which is seems very promising to me, concerning the active involvement of second generation migrants. Second generation because I must confess that, young second generation living in our countries start to be quite tired to be addressed like second generation. So they decided to create in November 2016 a national coordination of associations of young people with migrant backgrounds, and they decided to call themselves National Coordination of New Generations of Italians. And last October, they decided to formally create an association. They work and sit in institutional tables at different ministries. They want to be recognized as active actors by institutions. And they elaborated a manifesto on integration, concentrated on 4 areas. One of these is work, of course. And if you are interested to know more about Congi, I will provide them after this seminar to the organizers and to all of you a few information about them. And also I inform you that mid-February they will hold a very important 2-day seminar in Padova devoted to the first thing that you were mentioning concerning how we talk about migration in media, social networks, and among ourselves. And the title of this event is Protagonisti, because they want to be protagonists of how their story are told. And they will tell their story directly in Padova mid-February, and you're all welcome to participate if you so wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now on to Manjula Luthria. I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, but I hope so. Senior economist in the social protection, labor, and jobs global practice at the World Bank.
Thank you, James. Yes, you did pronounce it perfectly. Thank you to Bruegel as well, and thank you to everyone who's in this room. Well, the joys of coming last are that everything that has to be said to make the case has been said, so I don't need to go over and make the case and underscore any important things, because nothing has been left unsaid. So I get I suppose the nice luxury of critiquing a little bit and pushing on some points that I think need to be pushed a bit further. So maybe three quick points, right? One on sort of the facts and the stage setting. One on the discourse on access versus integration. And then a final point on the need for more innovation, which I think comes from cooperation. Yeah, so just quickly. And then I'll pose some questions, which hopefully become a segue into a broader discussion. On the stage setting and the facts, I very much come from the same school of thought. I think we've all been producing and consuming some of the same literature and empirical analysis on the benefits of immigration, both at a global level as well as partial equilibrium level. So just one caveat there, though. We've all become quite used to this 3% or 3.3% figure. That's roughly the ratio of migrants to global population. That's been quite stable over the last couple of decades, and that often sort of poses a little bit of a quandary to many that, well, how come, if the ratio has been so stable, why are we suddenly seeing all these anti-immigrant sort of rhetoric rise? And there may be many reasons for the rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric, but one little caveat on this data that I think is useful to bear in mind is that while that ratio may look remarkably stable, the stock of international migrants has indisputably gone up by about 65% in the last 25 years. So that's not insignificant. So there are more immigrants. And while South-South mobility has always been important, remains hugely important even today, the biggest growth, though, is in South-North migration. So people from poor countries moving to rich countries, or moving at least to countries which have had sustainable growth over some period of time, right? And this should be no surprise, because wage differentials are the biggest motivator of mobility, and wage differentials are huge even today, and convergence hasn't quite worked out in the way we might have imagined that it would 20 years ago. So this is something to keep in mind. In addition, so where immigrants are coming, they're coming, yes, driven by wage differentials to places which have the promise of income growth, and so therefore quite concentrated in particular hubs, right? So certain cities in the world in particular, you will see, have been completely transformed positively in an economic sense, but to those who are also worried about how visible immigration is, it is much more visible in particular hubs, in particular cities of the world. And I think this needs to be kept in mind, coupled with the fact, and I think both the opening keynote speech and then your report as well, Jolt, stress this, but I just want to say it one more time, that the relationship, and this is important for donors, that with this backdrop already, the relationship that needs to be borne in mind is that the relationship between economic development and migration is an inverted U shape, right? So I think many of us for a long time have believed that if there was more economic development at home, and then we use the word root causes of migration would be addressed, and somehow root causes are, I think, is a term that should be reserved for sort of disease. But the idea that somehow if we pushed aid out and created jobs which are absolutely imperative and should be done, but that somehow that would curtail migration, isn't going to happen if you look at this and you believe in this inverted U-shaped relationship. And where does this inverted U-shape peak? And I think this has really burst the bubble on a lot of conventional wisdom. Peaks at around $7,000 per capita. That's huge. Think of the number of migrants sending source countries that are nowhere near the $7,000 per capita, right? So more migration is coming. I think you've already made the case for that in Europe, even more so with aging. And then comes a recent IMF McKinsey report that says how much more could we gain globally if we did integration better, and the answer to that seems to be about $1 trillion more, right? So that's not insignificant either, and in that context I would say the fact that second-generation migrants in Europe are doing worse, not worse than natives, somehow we've come to expect that, but worse than first-generation migrants is appalling, and I think that's cause for concern, and immediately I think cause for action as well. So that's sort of my block of comments on sort of the data and the facts. Yeah? Then a little source of something that unsettles me a little bit is, well, before it unsettles me, let me just say it's wonderful that the conversation, at least in some parts of the world, has started to shift from issues of access. Should we allow access, should we not, to foreigners, to our labor market, has shifted a bit from that to integration. And in Europe, I suppose that's been spurred and nudged very much by the recent arrivals of refugees, right? And so the discourse has become, our problem is more with integration, not with access. And it's wonderful to focus on integration as Europe should. That being said, I get a little bit unsettled when the issues of integration and the issues of access get decoupled too much. And there I just wanted to make two quick points. One is that there are actually trade-offs between access and integration. If you look at, say, the bloc of Gulf countries that allow huge access, but don't care one bit about integration, are able to admit a whole lot more migrants, and that's food for thought. Now, I'm not recommending, and nor do I foresee, that Europe is going to go the way of the Gulf, and nor are most democracies, But this does create a conversation around what types of immigration might we want and could better serve both source and destination country needs. If they were temporary versus what sorts of migration regimes do we want to create that are permanent? And I think this conversation around temporary and permanent had been had in Europe, I know, several decades ago, but perhaps it's time for that again. So there are some sectors like agriculture, highly seasonal, perhaps amenable to some sort of temporary programs. Others like aged care, not so seasonal, and therefore perhaps need a more permanent sort of pathway, right? And then the second point related to this about the decoupling of access and integration is that how people get here, I think, completely determines how they might integrate, right? So the idea of posing integration as an ex post outcome and then focusing just on that and wondering why integration is so bad, I think is an incomplete conversation. And I think until we include the conversations of access, which of course for refugees and economic migrants are completely different. The age structures are different, the volumes are different, the skill sets of these people are different. So these are two different populations. But I would say even within economic migration, we should take a long and hard look at how many legal pathways actually exist for a diverse set of skill levels, not just for the high skill, the computer engineers, the doctors, the brain surgeons, but the messy part, right? The mid-skill to low skill. How many legal pathways exist for those? And I would bet you too few, right? So this is where I think the issues of access and integration are really just two sides of the same coin, and the cleaner, clearer the legal pathways for different skills, I think the better outcomes on integration are bound to follow. And then a final point on where I think innovation and cooperation is needed, right? Maybe at three levels. One of public policy, one at the level of the private sector, and then one for the host society, right? And in each, I want to make one point and then a question. On public policies, right? And this is the bit about, again, this is a bit about legal pathways. Public policies, I think, need to now more overtly begin to tie immigration policy to labor market needs, right? Family reunification has always been important, and so will a bunch of other geopolitical considerations, clearly. But tying it more explicitly to labor market needs, I think, is something that needs to be done without apology and speak to the self-interest of destination countries, and may allow actually carving out a discourse that allows legal pathways for various skill levels, right? Here my question is, to what extent can we, in this public policy bucket, think about the role of aid and whether aid can actually spur better cooperation with source countries where some preparation of their populations that are getting ready for migration to access the labor market and then also get better socially integrated, how that process of preparation can actually begin at home. And could public policies and aid come closer together to actually make that happen, right? On the private sector, right? Clearly that's where, and we've seen examples of it already, that's where the big innovation is going to happen. Without the private sector, these are the employers, these are the ones with jobs, right? So without the private sector, this argument is a non-starter, right? And thank goodness we're seeing lots of innovation come from there. My question, though, is I've been struck comparing how vocal and how visible the private sector was in trade, how almost absent it is in the discussions on labor market liberalization. And I've said this before in Berlin, I wonder, and this is a question, is it so difficult for the private sector to be seen as vocal proponents of immigration? Because somehow this is an issue on which the far left and the far right somehow managed to form an unholy alliance, and And there's just no way to get this right. And hopefully we'll have a conversation on whether that can be broken out of. And then the final point on sort of host society here, and this has been touched upon by everyone who's spoken on this today, the role of perceptions, right? And we've seen fairly depressing data on what public perceptions on migration have looked like over the past few years. A little bit of good news, though, is that the places that actually have more migrants are actually less resistant to immigration. That's got to be great news. That's the point of light we need to gravitate towards. When you look at the voting patterns around the Swiss referendum, the cantons that had never seen a migrant voted against it, the places that actually had migrants voted for it. So this, I think, has to be our moment of getting oxygen and finding how we actually use this good piece of data. The sad news and the question there, though, is this. We're just going to be releasing a paper soon at the World Bank, which also looks at public perceptions, just as you have, but then looks at, does it matter? Do the perceptions of the median voter in a destination country matter to policymakers? And the answer, sadly, is yes. Policymakers follow the median voter. And so this is the difficult part of it. How are we going to actually get policymakers to sort of not follow public opinion? And I think that's difficult, but I think that's the conversation we need to have. What are we doing about all this in the bank? I should just say, to sort of tie in both the public policy, the role of private sector perceptions. We obviously have an active research department that works on these issues, but where I think we're getting more traction is on pilots, bilateral pilots between source and destination countries, where we're able to systematically learn about design, about impact, change norms, and forge some of these partnerships. And I think while global fora will provide language for better migration outcomes, I think the real work and the heavy lifting is going to happen at the local level, and there I think there's a lot of good news. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a tremendous amount of food for thought there. Maybe I'll do two quick questions here, and then we'll go to the audience and then the concluding remarks. For Marcela, I thought your example of the aid program for Central America was fascinating. I wonder how it relates to talk of a Marshall Plan for Africa to stem migration across the Mediterranean, and also how it relates to this inverted U-curve and the kind of $7,000 threshold. I mean, does it in any way sort of debunk that idea that development can actually increase and encourage migration in the short term?
I'll answer briefly, and hopefully we can get one more question from you before you have to go. But so I'm well aware of that U-curve, and it's true that it's a 7,000 number. It's kind of the same researcher who worked on the other shock stuff. But I think that is again, when we think about development, it is a long-term gain. And the idea is not only to help countries go beyond that curve, which is not very high, but also what we found with this research is the importance of shocks, financial shocks and violence shocks, which create these dramatic flows, which I think are things that we can do some things about. And on the development side, yes, I think there's a lot of work to make sure that aid is effective in averting the shocks, averting the crisis, and helping countries do what, move up that ladder and beyond there.
Thanks. As you mentioned, Roberto, I know you have to go, so a quick kind of final question for you. Marcela actually mentioned earlier the need for specific solutions for migrants and refugees. I mean, is it possible to devise a sort of specific regime for migrants and refugees that's different from the one that's in place for sort of ordinary residents, whether they're foreign or native? I mean, is it possible to devise specific products whereby a migrant who has just arrived, who may be in the process of getting his asylum application through, is there a way for him to open or her to open a bank account, for instance?
Yes, thank you very much. My answer is yes. As I mentioned, the main problem is the identification of immigrants and refugees when they have no identity card or passport immediately available. Of course, opening a bank account or having a mobile payment system based on another framework requires identification. It's not possible to open an account or to have access even for very basic instruments to the financial system without the know your customer basic rule. But once again, the point that was mentioned before and the proposal in the report to have an identity document for refugees issued by public authorities or maybe through the ONG process, if possible, is the first step, is something that could be feasible and could definitely help to include, for the financial point of view, immigrants, including refugees who need this opening of bank account.
Thank you. A quick question for Tatiana. We saw from Zsolt's presentation that there was kind of strong economic evidence that immigration does not depress wages and that there is no sort of competition for jobs, which is sort of a very common perception. But we also saw a chart that showed that, for instance, Southern European countries do not have any labor shortages or have very, very small labor shortages. So my question for Tatiana is maybe, does that assessment, which is that there is no wage deflation and there is no competition for jobs, does that hold in Southern Europe?
Thank you, James. I start from the perception. There is a perception, quite widespread, that there is a competition for jobs and that migrant labor force contribute to the depression of wages in the public narrative discourse. Then you go to the facts and you see that there's no evidence of this, and there are still labor shortages, for example, in our labor market, and there's a concentration of migrants in the low-skilled sectors and professions, even when they are overqualified. So I wouldn't say there is an evidence of this, but once again, this is how it is perceived in most cases, and the argument is used very much in the public discourse. To go to your comment, how policymakers can deviate from the public opinion, I don't know, and I would say it's much more complicated when you are about to pass through a general election.
Thank you. Do you have anything else to add, maybe in response to what was said in the round of questions, Angela?
I'm eager to hear the questions of the audience, but I might just to add to what Tatiana just said. Look, the question of wage impact on natives, is it completely, we have global estimates of these things, but these are meaningless. These are completely questions that have very specific answers based on the specific labor market you're talking about. And the answer that we've seen across the studies that have been done is that for the most part, it doesn't have a negative wage effect. Say in the US, there was earlier a study that showed that it did, and then there was overturned subsequently. But that's not to say that we should shy away from the fact that there are cases where there will be distributional impacts. There will be winners and losers, as there are with almost every economic policy. So there could be losers, right? And it all comes down to who the migrants are and whether they are, which part of the native population they are, what we in economist terms call perfect substitutes. So if there's complementarity, you're going to see an increase in economic welfare all around, and if there is substitutability, you're actually going to see some tensions. I think that as economists, we shouldn't hide from the fact that there are distributional consequences. I think what we haven't done is the additional step of thinking through how we actually address some of these distributional issues, right? And we should be used to that, right? We should be used to finding ways for winners to compensate losers. I don't think we've done the hard thinking on that. And it's starting to happen now, but it almost seems like it's coming too late after the distributional impact has already showed up in sort of voting patterns.
Certainly that's the case with trade. Any other any questions from the audience? Yes, back there. If you could introduce yourself and also keep your question brief, please.
Implementing. Who do the panel think should be primarily responsible for resolving the issue of a single identity for migrants and refugees?
From my perspective and experience, in Italy, the main responsibility is under the Minister of Home Affairs. What we can do from the financial point of view is to ensure that for the obligation to identify the customer for opening a bank account, to clarifying guidelines that it's sufficient, that it's reliable, the identity document provided to refugees, even if it is a sort of initial identity document that has to be further confirmed by other procedure or steps. This is something we can do also because the opening of banking account, if there are no other movements or very complicated and sophisticated transactions, has basically no risk of money laundering at all. So on the risk-based approach I mentioned before, a very simple identity document is more than enough as a first step for CDD.
Interesting. Any other questions? Right here in the aisle.
From the Istituto Affari Internazionali. I actually wanted to thank Mrs. Lutria for mentioning the issue of legal pathways, because I was a bit surprised that in the study, whilst data shows that for demographic and for labor shortage reasons, actually migration to Europe would be needed, this was not among the bold recommendations that I found at the end of the study. And regarding Italy, I was wondering, I mean, I know that there is the Decreto Flussi, which nevertheless is quite limited, let's say, because in numbers and also because it focuses very much on seasonal workers. So I was wondering if you could say anything on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. On Decreto Flussi and the legal pathways to access our country for work reasons, you're right, it's quite weak, actually. Weak numbers, mainly for seasonal work or for access for conversion of other kinds of permits, like traineeship permits, study permits, vocational training permits, and there is a small part of entries for autonomous work. Why? This depends to how our legislation designed this Decreto Flussi and the economic performance of the country in the last 10 years. You have to keep these two things in mind. Our legislation provides that every year a Decreto Flussi is adopted, but every year the Decreto Flussi cannot go over the quotas established the year before. And there was a point in time when these quotas were reduced, strongly reduced, because of the economic crisis, because of the huge unemployment rates, and it was politically very difficult to adopt Decreto Flussi with important numbers to allow people from abroad to come and work in Italy when our labor market was suffering for the economic crisis. But then you cannot go back. Once you go down, you cannot go up unless you adopt a mid-term plan on migration for labor reasons. It was adopted only once, to my memory, in Italy, and it took 3 years of discussions to adopt it, because the way it is regulated in our framework legislation on migration is so complex that it took 3 years. So this is an issue for the new parliament. We need to revise the legislation if we want to have back an instrument to manage migration flows, legal migration flows for work reasons. And we'll have a new parliament in a few weeks. There have been initiatives in the last months and years. The most recent are one coming from the trade unions, of revision of the Testo Unico Immigrazione, and the other one is a citizenship, active citizenship initiative, the Ero Straniero campaign that you probably know. Both proposals have been presented to the parliament, but then the legislation was over. So the legislature was over. So let's wait and see what the new parliament will think about it.
Thank you. One more question? If there are any? Yep, right back there.
Okay. Hello, my name is Patrick Duell from the European Commission, Director General for Migration and Home Affairs. Actually, more than a question, I would just like to make a quick clarification and comment. First, on the proposal that was raised for a kind of EU-wide ID card for refugees, as also the ongoing very difficult negotiations on the reform of the common European asylum system show, the competence of the European Union in this area has certain limitations. It's very difficult to agree and to further promote harmonization in this area, so I fear that at least for the time being, on the basis of the current EU treaties, it will be impossible to have such a kind of European-wide identity card. As was pointed out, I mean, this is for the time being rather a national competence. Maybe the EU could strive for some harmonization in this area, but not much more. Then I would also like to briefly come back to the distinction between refugees and other migrants, which is, of course, extremely important, in particular in legal terms. But I think the comment was also made that refugees, in some presentation, I think it was mentioned that refugees are not or do not have the same need of integration because they're supposed to go one day back to their country. I don't have now the exact figures, but actually it turns out that many refugees, they tend to stay in their host countries. And there's a strong need for integration, including labor market integration as well. And indeed, many efforts are also going in that sense in many European countries. Of course, these people then may also compete for labor, for labor with the other migrants, with the natives, and this, of course, then may also have an impact on the general legal migration access to the European member states. There I would like to come back quickly also to the comparisons that was made, for instance, with some of the Middle East countries of the Arabian Peninsula as well, which have apparently very wide labor market access. At the same time, it needs also to be taken into account that these countries, for instance, they haven't accepted any refugees from Syria or other countries, whereas the European Union has accepted more than 3 times more refugees than the US, Canada, Japan and Australia combined. So I think this should also be put into this perspective. Coming also to the recommendations that was made, if the public administrations could to some extent support the preparation of legal migration from third countries to the European Union. So the European Commission has already financed in the past a number of projects in this regard to provide capacity building to some third countries to support their authorities, employment agencies, etc. But not all of these projects have been very successful because the European Union as such has no competence in deciding who can come to the European Union, because this remains the competence of the member states. So we are trying to build also on these not always very positive experiences now to better team up with the member states, but then of course also with the private sector, who at the end has to provide any possibilities in terms of labor market, so as to have some kind of public-private partnerships, let's say, to make sure that these projects will then eventually also lead to real migration, legal migration pathways to the European Union. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. I think at this stage we're sort of running late, so I will hand the floor to Natalie Tocci, the director of the Institute for International Affairs, and say thank you very much to all the panelists for a great conversation, and to the audience for listening in and participating.
Thank you, James, and I'll be extremely brief. Well, first I want to say probably the most important thing, which is unrelated to content, and that is the fact that on behalf of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and I'm looking at Zolt and colleagues, I'm extremely happy for this first instance of cooperation between IAI and Bruegel, and I really and sincerely hope that it will be one of a long list of things that we're going to be doing in future. Moving on to content, which of course is why you are all here, let me start off by firstly applauding Bruegel's report. I really think that it has done a great service in a situation and in a context in which the debate about migration often looks extremely and sounds extremely different from what we have been listening to over the last 3 hours or so. I think this report essentially has 2 major and obviously related aspects of value added in this conversation. I mean, firstly, it is a report which is fact and evidence based. And whether those facts and that evidence actually have to do with perceptions, I think that was a fascinating bit of the conversation, disturbing in many respects, indeed this mismatch between perception and reality, but with a silver lining, as we were hearing as well, meaning that actually in those areas in which there is more migration, actually the perception tends to be less detached from reality. Data on history, historical flows, data on demography and labour market integration, and more broadly, data about labour and labour integration and financial inclusion. Second, and as I said, related, value added, I think, of this study is the fact that it actually adds an economic lens to a conversation, which is generally a very different conversation because it is viewed from the lens of security/identity. And I'm not trying to argue here, how could I, given my field of expertise, I'm not trying to deny here that there is an important security and identity dimension of this conversation, but the problem is that in the public debate, these two dimensions have completely hijacked the conversation, and therefore adding a more sober and fact-based, as I was saying, dimension of this in the public debate, I think, is extremely important. Now, moving on to the recommendations, I was also struck, and there was, I think, a question, I can't remember who raised it from the floor, I was also struck by the fact that actually, although the analysis was very much focused on this economic lens, if you like, in the recommendations, the security aspects came back in. And I was scratching my head in trying to figuring out the logic of this. And I actually do think that there is a logic to it. And I think that logic is related to a story about perceptions. Because, of course, perceptions, and we were hearing this when discussing what governments and what politicians listen to, and yes, unfortunately, they do take into account those perceptions, or rather misperceptions, the security dimension of this, and whether the security dimension is border management, security cooperation with neighboring countries, etc., in my view is primarily important because, and to the extent to which it reduces the hype, it reduces the crisis mode, it actually enables for this kind of conversation to be not just a conversation amongst us, but to become a much broader conversation with the broader public. And I think that wider conversation and therefore the sequencing of indeed having a security dimension of the response makes sense, firstly because it allows for a different analytical debate about migration, and also a more granular debate, analytical debate about migration. Indeed, I was always struck by, the usual mantra, well, all we need to do is long-term development. So yes, we do short-term cooperation, security cooperation, but then we do long-term development, and actually in the long term it's all going to be fine because that development is going to stop migration. Ooh, well, it's a bit more complicated than this. I mean, the U-curve that we were discussing earlier, which of course casts in a completely different light, again, hype and hyperbole proposals such as the Marshall Plan for Africa, as if that's ever going to happen anyway. So, I think, if you like, reducing the level of crisis mode enables both a deeper and more granular analytical conversation, and it also enables a far more sort of all-encompassing debate about what the policy response should be. And as I said, obviously, no one denies the fact that there is and has to be a security component to this, but it will only make sense to the extent that it doesn't simply reduce that crisis mode and therefore you just park the issue and move on to other things, but actually means that alongside that security component, you also have a host of other measures. And development is, yes, one aspect to this, but it's a fairly small aspect to this. I think far more important as part of this conversation is the debate that we were beginning to have about legal channels and labour migration, and also a debate that we actually didn't touch upon so much, which is trade. there's a lot at the moment going on. If I think about EU policy, what do we do in whatever places like Agadez? Well, yes, we have security cooperation, but then you also try and foster sustainable agriculture. Perfect. Where are those tomatoes going to be sold to? I mean, do we expect them to simply stuff their faces with tomatoes? So it obviously makes sense to the extent to which you actually look at this as a response that makes sense, because it includes, yes, security, includes trade, it includes development, it includes labour migration, and it's that broader joined up response which can actually enable us to deal and, yes, to manage and to govern what is basically a structural phenomenon which is here to stay for the decades to come. So thank you very much.